What did they do to my land? For 2 years, I lived away from home, taking care of my sick mother in Oregon. 2 years away from the hills where I had planted every power pole with my own hands. When I returned, 12 commercial buildings stood tall on my property, their cables buried deep into the private grid I designed years ago. Linda, the president of the Homeowners Association, handed me a thick folder and said everything was perfectly legal. But what froze my blood was the nameplate on the main switchboard. It still carried my name, a registration that had never been transferred. How could they build an entire complex on private land and use my power? I was about to show them where real authority comes from. You ever had neighbors who went too far? Tell me your story. I didn't speak that day. Words would have been wasted. Instead, I stood at the edge of my property and stared at the 12 buildings humming under the sun. The sound of air conditioners, saws, and power lines blended into one ugly symphony. The earth that used to smell like cedar and metal now reeked of concrete. I ran my hand along the rusted gate my father built in 1982, feeling the familiar dent near the hinge. This was the place where he taught me how to ground a transformer. Control the current. And you control the room, he used to say. I guess Linda had learned that lesson too, in her own twisted way. The next morning she appeared again, wearing her usual polished smile, carrying a cup of coffee that smelled too sweet. Logan, I know this looks sudden, she began, flipping through pages as if the papers themselves could make her right. While you were away, the board approved the expansion plan. You'll love what we've done. A community cafe, retail, a wellness studio. This will raise everyone's property value. Her tone dripped with self-justification. I asked. On my land. She hesitated only a second before answering. Technically. It's part of the shared development zone. You didn't maintain it for over a year. The law allows us to act in the neighborhood's best interest. She said it like I should thank her for stealing from me. After she left, I walked the perimeter again. Every conduit, every pole, every cable felt wrong. I reached the main substation I built behind the barn. The lock was gone, the door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was warm and humming. Thick industrial cables led straight from my main breaker to their buildings. Someone had stripped my lines and spliced into them using my access points. It was neat work, professional even. Whoever did it knew what they were doing and knew I wouldn't be here to stop them. The meter still ran under my name. They weren't paying for their power. I was. That night, I opened my father's old metal cabinet labeled Pierce Subgrid. Inside were hand-drawn maps, dated and signed, the kind of documentation lawyers drool over. Our system was licensed under the state's Rural Energy Act, private ownership, permanent authorization. I checked the county records online. My property ID existed, but the service deed read pending verification. Someone had filed a duplicate request while I was gone. The timestamp, last spring, right before construction began. The office noted, original misplaced during departmental relocation. I couldn't help but laugh. Bureaucracy always has the best excuses. The following day, I drove to the regional utilities office. A clerk in his 20s clicked through his screen, frowning. Sir, according to this, your grid connection was merged under Willow Creek HOA's redevelopment permit. It's listed as communal infrastructure now. I leaned closer. Who authorized that? He hesitated, scrolling again. A Martin Dorsey, maintenance engineer. I almost laughed out loud. Martin had been my apprentice 20 years ago. The kind of man who used to complain about ethics violations in city projects. I wondered how much a conscience cost these days. I drove back slower than usual, memorizing every power pole on the way. Each one marked a point of betrayal. By the time I reached home, the sun was bleeding out behind the new buildings. Their windows reflected orange light like fire-eating glass. I turned on my generator, the one they hadn't touched, and the hum returned. A different tone, deeper, older, mine. I pulled up my inspection drone from the storage shed, dusted off the lens, and powered it on. It still worked fine. I guided it across the property line, filming every illegal connection. By midnight, I had enough evidence to bury their claims under a mountain of legal filings. But I didn't file anything yet. Power is timing. If I moved too soon, they'd bury the proof. I needed more leverage, something irrefutable. So, I checked the state archives. If I could find the original license of the Pierce Subgrid with my father's signature and the county seal, that would end it. As I scrolled through the scanned records, I saw a faint flicker in my house lights. The current dipped for half a second, then returned. Somewhere in those new buildings, a system had overloaded. I smiled to myself. That was the first sign of stress in their stolen network. Lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. My ceiling fan spun slow, its hum syncing with the pulse in my temple. Linda thought she'd won because she had the board, the papers, and the noise of progress. People like her build their empires on silence, on others being too polite to resist. But silence is temporary. Circuits hum, wires heat, and when the balance tips, everything burns. I glanced at the map pinned on my wall, tracing the old grid lines my father and I once measured in the dirt. Every wire still led back to me. Every light they turned on was a reminder that their comfort depended on my patience. When I finally rose, I looked out the window. The 12 buildings glowed bright, confident, untouchable. My house, small and dark, stood apart like a forgotten outpost. I didn't need their light. The system that powered them was mine. Legally, structurally, and morally. I had the proof. I had the motive. All I needed was the right moment. Let them finish building. Let them think they owned the current. Because when the day came, I wouldn't shout. I'd just pull one switch. By the end of that week, word had spread that I was making trouble again. That was Linda's favorite phrase, always whispered just loud enough to reach my ears. Neighbors who used to wave now crossed the street. Someone spray-painted community land on my old gate in sloppy white letters. It would have been laughable if it weren't so deliberate. Isolation is the first move of any control game, and Linda played it well. The HOA had built more than structures. They had built a narrative. According to them, I was the bitter recluse, hoarding land meant for progress. I received a notice from the HOA attorney on Monday morning, a thick envelope with the smell of toner and self-importance. Mr. Pierce, it began, your continued interference with approved infrastructure may constitute obstruction of community development. The document cited sections of municipal code that didn't even apply to private grids. They wanted me to respond within 10 days or face an injunction. Legal intimidation by template. I folded the letter neatly and set it aside. Fear wasn't their weapon. Exhaustion was. They counted on paperwork to bury patience. Linda invited me to a board meeting for transparency. I went. The conference room was filled with glossy posters showing their new vision of progress. 12 commercial buildings, a planned plaza, even a parking lot expansion. Not one mention of who owned the power source beneath it all. Linda stood at the front, glowing under fluorescent lights. We're building a stronger community, she said, glancing at me like she was daring me to disagree. Our electrical integration has been seamless thanks to cooperative planning. Cooperative. A beautiful lie wrapped in bureaucracy. When the meeting ended, one of the board members, a retired contractor named Paul, caught me outside. Logan, between us, he said quietly. I saw the plans. Your substation's still listed under your name. They just adjusted the service boundaries. His tone carried both guilt and fear. Adjusted, I repeated, as in erased. He didn't answer. People like Paul survive by silence. He walked away before anyone could see us talking. But that small confession was enough. It confirmed what I suspected: they had altered the records intentionally, not accidentally. That night I began gathering everything. I downloaded county zoning maps, pulled copies of electrical permits, and printed every email thread I could find between the HOA and the Energy Department. Most were public records, hidden behind layers of dull government web pages. Buried in one thread was a familiar name, Martin Dorsey. His approval note read, HOA expansion complies with temporary grid access under Code Revision 1978. My jaw tightened. That code had been invalid for over 20 years. Martin had resurrected an obsolete law to justify their theft. It wasn't incompetence. It was design. I sent Martin an email at midnight. The subject line read, Grid Integration Inquiry. I wrote only one sentence, still standing on old ethics. Or did you sell them? No reply came. I didn't expect one. The next morning, a black SUV idled near my driveway for nearly 20 minutes before leaving. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe a reminder that the HOA had friends in the right offices. In small towns, corruption doesn't hide in shadows. It smiles in daylight and shakes your hand at the grocery store. Later that day, I went to the county records office again. The clerk from before, the young one, looked up nervously when he saw me. Mr. Pierce, you shouldn't be here, he whispered. They're reviewing your file. The HOA claims your grid is part of a shared maintenance project now. I asked to see the documentation. He hesitated, then printed it anyway. The page showed my property ID crossed out and replaced with Zone B, Communal Utility District. There was Martin's signature again, neat and fraudulent. The clerk leaned closer. I shouldn't say this, but one of the inspectors didn't sign off on this merger. He filed a note questioning it. I think his name was Alan Harper. That was my new lead. I found Alan through a professional directory. He worked as a field inspector but had recently gone on leave. I called the number listed. A tired voice answered. I know why you're calling, he said before I introduced myself. You're not wrong, Mr. Pierce. The boundaries were altered after hours. I flagged it, but my report was deleted the next day. I asked if he had proof. A long pause followed. Check the archived emails from March 12th. My draft might still exist in the server logs. Then he hung up. Fear travels fast when power's involved. That night, I accessed the public record portal again and scrolled through the archives. Most files were locked, but one attachment caught my eye, a half-deleted email with the subject line, Boundary Verification Discrepancy. The timestamp matched Alan's date. The file contained scanned coordinates, my coordinates showing the true electrical grid layout. It proved that the HOA's construction extended 30 feet into private land. I printed everything, slid it into a folder, and labeled it Phase 1. When dawn came, I drove out to the ridge where my father's first pole still stood. The wood had weathered silver, the metal bolts streaked with rust. I ran my hand over it and whispered, They think they can erase this. The wind carried the low hum of power lines from the new complex, like an arrogant echo. Every surge of current reminded me whose energy they stole. I didn't need revenge. I needed precision. Justice isn't loud. It's methodical. On my way back, I passed Linda's car parked near the substation. She was talking to a man in a gray suit, holding what looked like another set of papers. She saw me and waved with that same public smile. Just a maintenance check, she called out. I nodded, pretending to believe her. As they drove off, I caught the scent of burnt insulation in the air. Faint, but sharp. I walked to the substation and opened the side panel. Inside, a new wire had been added, a monitoring device connected to my main output. They were tracking my power flow, probably to prove shared usage. I stared at the small, blinking light and felt something shift inside me. They wanted to rewrite ownership not with violence but with paperwork and deceit. That was their weapon. Fine. I had my own. The evidence from Alan. The coordinates, the service logs, they were enough to start a case, but I wasn't ready to go to court yet. Not until I secured the entire source. Control first, exposure later. That night, the lights in the complex flickered again. Twice this time. A ripple across the horizon. I watched from my porch as the glow dimmed and returned. Somewhere. Their system was straining. It wouldn't be long before the load imbalance revealed the truth. I poured myself a drink, opened the file labeled Phase 1, and began drafting Phase 2. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about precision. I woke before dawn, the kind of quiet hour when the air feels electric. My laptop screen glowed pale blue in the dark office, lines of coordinates flickering across it. Allen's deleted report had confirmed what I already knew. The HOA's construction bled into my property. But what caught my attention most was a second set of coordinates, deeper in the file, tagged with a note that read, "Duplicate submission, unauthorized revision." Someone had altered the official blueprints. That someone had Martin's signature. Every crime leaves a trace, even white-collar ones hidden behind clean PDF files. I decided it was time to start tracing. I drove to the county's archive building as soon as the sun rose. The clerk barely looked up when I requested physical access to the infrastructure plans. Most people ask for birth certificates, not power maps. "You'll find those in the back," he said, pointing toward a metal cabinet labeled Grid Expansion 1980 to 2000. I spent hours flipping through brittle paper until I found two maps, one official, one revised. The first bore my father's signature and the state seal. The second had the same markings but with one subtle change. A boundary line shifted 20 yards west. That adjustment alone transferred several thousand square feet of land to the HOA's jurisdiction. It was clean forgery, maybe even genius. Back home, I laid the two maps side by side on my workbench. I turned on the overhead lamp, letting the light cut through the transparent overlay. The difference glared at me like a scar. My father's handwriting was strong and curved. The forged edition was sharp, mechanical, printed with a modern drafting pen. Someone had scanned the original, edited the line digitally, then reprinted it on archival paper. To the untrained eye, it would pass inspection, but to me, it screamed artificial. I took photos, then folded the fake map neatly into an evidence sleeve. Proof was beginning to take shape. That evening, I checked the email again from the anonymous engineer who had first tipped me off. The address was encrypted, something like Waterlight at Proton Mail. A single line had been added since my last login. Check transformer 32. Panel log discrepancy. No greeting, no signature, just a breadcrumb. Transformer 32 sat on the far edge of my land, where the HOA's new parking lot met the ridge. If there was a fault in that system, it might expose the illegal connection in real time. I packed my tool bag and flashlight, waiting for the complex to quiet down before I moved. Around midnight, I walked along the dirt road behind the construction site. The sky was moonless, only the faint buzz of power lines guiding my way. Transformer 32 was easy to spot, a squat metal box surrounded by gravel. When I opened the side panel, a gust of warm air hit my face. Inside, one of the connection logs had been tampered with. The serial tag read HOA 17B, but my records showed Pierce 17B. They hadn't even bothered to re-stamp the serial code. They'd simply scraped it, painted over, and etched the new one by hand. Amateur arrogance. I photographed everything and replaced the cover. As I stood up, headlights flashed behind me. A car slowed on the service road. I froze. Linda's SUV. She rolled down the window halfway. "You shouldn't be here, Logan," she said calmly. "This is private property." The irony almost made me laugh. So was mine. I replied. Her expression didn't change. "You're making things difficult for everyone. The board can still offer compensation if you cooperate." The word compensation sounded like a bribe wearing perfume. I said nothing. She waited a beat, then drove off, tires crunching on gravel. I could feel her eyes on me through the rearview mirror until she turned the corner. When I got home, I transferred the photos from my camera to a secure drive. Every image was dated, geotagged, and cross-referenced with county data. The forgery, the altered transformer, the overlapping maps, they all fit into one pattern. HOA theft wasn't an accident. It was a coordinated cover-up. I labeled the folder Phase 2 Evidence. The sound of the generator outside filled the silence. Steady and patient, it reminded me that real power doesn't announce itself. It hums beneath the surface, waiting. The next day, I contacted an old friend, Sarah from the Department of Infrastructure Audits. She owed me a favor from a job we did years ago. "Off the record," I said on the phone. If someone filed a map revision with a digital overlay, could you check the metadata? She hesitated. That's risky. Logan. They track access logs, I replied. Then do it during system maintenance. You'll find the file under Willow Creek HOA submission May 5th. A long pause followed, then a sigh. I'll see what I can do. She hung up. Sometimes loyalty isn't friendship, it's shared disgust. By evening, she sent a text. Found it. File edited from external IP. Timestamp doesn't match submission date. Attached hash code proves alteration. She attached the raw metadata, proof that the blueprint had been changed after certification. It was exactly what I needed. But there was something else. A system username linked to the edit. M. Dorsey Internal. My old apprentice hadn't just approved the forgery, he'd created it. I printed everything and pinned it above my workbench. Each document was a thread in a web of deceit. At the center sat Linda and Martin, feeding off each other's ambitions. She wanted control of the community. He wanted contracts and influence. Together, they'd rewritten my legacy into their convenience. The irony was poetic. My father had built that grid to bring light to a neglected corner of the county, and now those who lived off that light were trying to erase his name. That night, the wind picked up, carrying the faint rattle of loose cables. I stepped outside, listening. Somewhere near the ridge, a transformer hummed unevenly. I could tell by ear it was overloaded. The HOA's new lights had pushed the system past capacity. Sparks danced briefly across the metal casing before vanishing into the dark. I smiled to myself. The more they built, the closer they came to failure. I didn't need to sabotage anything. Gravity was doing it for me. I went back inside and sat at the desk, staring at the collection of evidence, with Sarah's metadata and Alan's coordinates. I had enough to expose them, but exposure wasn't the goal yet. Timing mattered more than truth. They needed to believe they were still safe, still untouchable. I wanted them to feel the quiet comfort of power before it slipped away. I wanted them to flip a switch one morning and realize nothing answered. I turned off the lamp, letting the darkness settle. The hum of the grid pulsed faintly in the distance, steady but strained. Everything that hums eventually burns out. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the anticipation rise like static in the air. The next move wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about control. The next week came with rain, the kind that soaked through soil and memory alike. I spent the mornings studying old maps, tracing each line of the Pierce Subgrid until I could see it even with my eyes closed. Every pole, every transformer, every conduit told a story of work and intent. My father used to say that infrastructure was the only form of handwriting the earth respected. Looking out the window, I saw the new HOA buildings shimmering behind the mist. Their roofs were slick with rainwater, their parking lot glistening with stolen electricity. It was almost poetic how greed shined brightest in bad weather. By mid-afternoon, I decided to begin the second phase of my plan. Paper evidence was solid, but physical verification would make it irrefutable. I called an independent surveyor firm 3 towns over, posing as a consultant for an energy resilience project. They agreed to send a small team that weekend. We charge by the acre, the supervisor said. Fine, I replied. Just bring calibrated meters and a clean copy of your state license. I hung up and opened my files again. My goal was simple: confirm that the HOA's lines ran through unlicensed ground and collect readings from every illegal connection. When the surveyors arrived, I guided them quietly along the ridgeline. The lead technician, a woman named Marla, frowned when her scanner beeped. Sir, this system's feeding dual voltage. One source comes from a private subgrid. That's not standard. I watched the rain slide off her hard hat. No, I said, it's not. She took more readings, checking transformer after transformer. Each one confirmed the same thing: the HOA's grid was drawing power from my source, even routing excess current into their backup generators. Who signed off on this? She asked. I handed her a name: Martin Dorsey. Her eyes widened slightly. Then you'll want this report notarized. That night, I stored the signed survey documents in a waterproof case and placed it inside my safe. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills like a restless animal. I walked to the window and watched lightning strike somewhere near the complex. The buildings flickered for a moment before stabilizing. It reminded me of a heart skipping a beat. The system was stretched thin, overloaded by its own ambition. Nature had a way of warning thieves before judgment arrived. I poured a drink, sat back, and thought of the next move. Verification was done. Now came acquisition. The next day, I drove 2 hours to the state capitol to meet with an old acquaintance from the Water and Power Commission, a manager named Hayes who owed me a favor. He was the kind of man who spoke in low tones and long pauses. Private substations can be reassigned, he told me, but only if the owner requests a capacity review. After that, the commission can issue a transfer of service rights. I asked what that meant in practice. He smiled faintly. It means if you apply first, you own the right to supply power to everyone tied to your grid. I leaned forward. Even if they don't know it yet. He nodded, especially then. The process required collateral. I signed the initial paperwork using my property deed as proof of infrastructure ownership. It felt surreal to reclaim something that was already mine. The clerk stamped the papers with a blue seal, and the sound echoed like a verdict. The first step toward legal dominion over the entire grid was complete. All I needed now was the approval of the technical audit, which would come in a few weeks. I left the office carrying both the paperwork and a quiet satisfaction. Control was no longer theoretical, it was in motion. When I returned home, the HOA had posted new signs along the fence line: private property, no trespassing, under construction. The irony didn't even sting anymore. I took photos of the signs for record. As I did, I noticed 2 utility trucks near the substation. Men in reflective vests pretending to inspect cables. One of them noticed me and made a call. They left 5 minutes later. Paranoia wasn't necessary. This was confirmation. They knew something was shifting. They could feel it in the current the same way I did. I decided to accelerate the next step before they could react. That evening, I visited the storage shed where my father's old generator parts were kept. Dust covered everything like a thin layer of history. I found the manual transfer switch we built together in the 1990s, designed to redirect flow during outages. I began cleaning the contacts and replacing the fuses. When it was finished, it looked almost ceremonial, a relic preparing for resurrection. Once installed, that switch would let me isolate my network from theirs in a single motion. No court order, no warning, just silence. But not yet. Patience was still the most efficient weapon. 2 nights later, the surveyor Marla called me again. "You might want to know," she said softly. "Someone contacted my firm asking for copies of your site readings." I asked who. "A lawyer representing the Willow Creek Homeowners Association." We didn't share anything, but they offered double our usual rate. Her voice carried a note of unease. "Whatever you're involved in, it's bigger than property lines." I thanked her and ended the call. She was right. This wasn't about boundaries anymore. It was about control over light itself. I spent the next day organizing my evidence into a digital case file, complete with metadata timestamps and legal citations. I wanted everything admissible if things escalated. Each folder felt like a quiet act of defiance. Linda might have controlled perception, but I controlled proof. That night, I backed everything onto 2 encrypted drives and stored one in a safety deposit box downtown. When I returned, my house was the only dark spot on the hill, surrounded by the white glare of the new complex. It looked almost symbolic, the lone shadow among counterfeit brightness. Before sleeping, I walked outside and stood near the first pole my father ever raised. The wood had darkened over time, but the grounding wire still gleamed faintly in the rain. I touched it and closed my eyes. The hum from the distant substation vibrated through the earth, deep and steady. They thought they had buried me under legal paperwork, but the current still answered to me. The system's bones were older, wiser, and loyal to their maker. I opened my eyes and looked toward the glowing skyline of the development. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt inevitability. Every stolen amp they drew brought them closer to collapse. Every day they operated was another day of evidence piling quietly in my favor. Soon the law would catch up. And when it did, no one would believe how simple the truth really was. I walked back inside, wiped the rain from my hands, and turned off the lights. The storm had passed, but the static in the air lingered. My generator hummed softly in the background, patient and steady. I smiled as I realized the irony. They were all living on borrowed current, and I was the lender. The morning I decided to act. The air was still, heavy with that peculiar quiet before a storm. I brewed my coffee and watched the steam curl upward, tracing invisible paths like the power lines outside my window. The paperwork from the commission lay neatly stacked on the table, waiting for my signature on the final clause. Once signed. The ownership of the Pierce Subgrid would extend to include water and energy distribution rights. It meant more than legal control, it meant autonomy. The same system they had stolen would soon make them my dependents. Control through silence. Justice without confrontation. By noon, I was driving into the city to meet a broker who specialized in energy assets. His office was inside an old red brick building across from the courthouse. A fitting coincidence. The man, Leonard, greeted me with the kind of grin reserved for clients who looked too calm to be harmless. "You're transferring grid rights?" he asked, skimming my file. "Unusual for a private owner." I nodded. "It's a consolidation. 100% legal. 100% mine." He raised a brow. "And the HOA using your network. They'll find out soon enough," I said. He laughed softly, not understanding the gravity of my words. The deal required capital, to buy full ownership of the auxiliary water rights tied to my grid. I had to mortgage part of my land. It wasn't a risk. It was an investment in justice. My father always said that true ownership comes not from money, but from accountability. I signed the agreement, feeling the weight of every stroke of ink. The numbers didn't scare me. They were clean, exact, measurable. Unlike deception, they left no room for doubt. Leonard stamped the file, and just like that, the transfer began its legal countdown. Within 30 days, the Pierce Subgrid would officially become the sole power and water supplier for the entire district. On my way home, I passed the construction site again. The workers were finishing the last of the concrete foundations. I slowed down, watching them from a distance. They didn't know that every pipe they buried, every line they extended, tied them closer to me. Their progress was my leverage. I parked at the edge of the property and stepped out, feeling the hum beneath the ground. The current was strong today, restless almost, as if it could sense the coming reversal. I smiled, imagining the moment Linda would realize what had happened. She'd built her little empire on borrowed current, and soon the invoice would arrive. That evening, I sat in my office surrounded by documents, survey reports, transfer deeds, commission receipts, all of it lined up like chess pieces. At the center lay the certificate of provisional ownership, sealed and notarized. It granted me temporary control pending final approval. That was enough to start. I uploaded a copy to 3 separate cloud servers, encrypted and time-stamped. Then I drafted an email to the commission, confirming activation of the audit schedule. My hand didn't shake. The feeling wasn't triumph, not yet. It was precision, like watching a perfectly measured circuit come alive. Linda called that night. Her voice was syrupy, forced calm hiding urgency. "Logan, we heard you've been moving papers around downtown," she said. "The board's concerned. If there's any misunderstanding, we can still fix this." I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch. "Fix it how I asked, finally. A financial settlement," she replied quickly. "We can offer fair compensation for your assets." Her pause on that last word told me everything. She already knew what I'd done. "You can't buy what's already mine," I said. "You tried once. This time, you'll be paying the bill." She started to argue, but I ended the call before her mask could slip further. Afterward, I walked to the window and watched the complex lights shimmer through the mist. Each glowing window was a thief's confession, written in wattage. My father's grid powered them all, and they didn't even know who to thank or who to fear. I thought about the day he taught me how to read voltage fluctuations. Every current carries intent, he'd said. Find the rhythm, and you'll find the truth. Tonight. The rhythm told me they were close to overloading. Greed always pushes systems past their limits. It's predictable, almost scientific. The next morning, I visited the regional bank to finalize the collateral transfer. The clerk, an older man with tired eyes, looked over my documents twice before speaking. You understand. Mr. Pierce, this effectively gives you operational control of the utility rights for Willow Creek Estates once approval clears. I nodded. That's the plan. He signed the final form and handed me a copy. Well, he said quietly, then I suppose they'll be your customers soon. I smiled faintly. They already are. They just don't know it yet. As I left the bank, I noticed a new billboard near the road leading to the complex. It showed Linda's face beside the words, "Building a Brighter Tomorrow." The irony almost made me stop the car. Her brighter tomorrow ran on my current. Her slogan was powered by my stolen light. I wondered how it would feel for her when those lights went dark. Not in anger, but in revelation. I didn't want revenge. I wanted recognition. The kind only silence can deliver. That evening, I returned to the substation to inspect the transfer switch. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and clean. I flipped open the metal panel and tested the new circuit breakers. Everything worked perfectly. The generator purred, steady and obedient. One motion, one signal, and the entire HOA grid would go dark. Not yet, I reminded myself. Patience. The final signatures hadn't cleared, and I needed legality on my side. When justice comes, it must arrive dressed in paperwork, not vengeance. Later that night, I stood outside again, watching the rows of buildings glowing against the black sky. Somewhere out there, Linda was sleeping comfortably under lights she thought she controlled. I wondered if she ever thought about the power humming beneath her feet. Who owned it? Who built it? Who could take it away? I finished my drink and turned off my porch light. My house vanished into the darkness while theirs kept burning. Let them think they'd won. For now. Inside, I placed the final contract inside my safe, next to the old family deeds. The hum of the generator faded as I powered it down, leaving only silence. It wasn't emptiness. It was the sound of inevitability. The transaction was already done. The outcome had just not caught up yet. I closed the safe, sat down, and wrote one line in my notebook, "Control restored through ownership." I smiled at the simplicity of it. Linda fought for dominance. I fought for precision. She had her board, her banners, her self-congratulation. I had the law, the data, and patience. And patience, like current, never forgets its source. By the time the commission confirmed my ownership, the air in Willow Creek felt charged with something heavier than summer heat. I received the official letter on a Thursday afternoon, its embossed seal catching the light like a quiet crown. The Pierce Subgrid was now, without question, the sole registered provider of electrical and water infrastructure for the district. I read the document twice before folding it carefully into my briefcase. Justice, it turned out, didn't roar. It arrived on legal stationery, signed in blue ink by someone who didn't even know they were restoring balance. I poured myself a glass of water, smiled at the irony, and began to plan the reveal. The Homeowners Association had scheduled its quarterly meeting for that weekend to announce the completion of the Willow Creek expansion. The irony was so thick it almost felt theatrical. Linda's invitation had arrived 2 days earlier, printed on glossy paper with gold trim. "Your attendance is appreciated," it read. I knew what she wanted: public validation, a stage to cement her image as a visionary. I decided to give her one, just not the kind she expected. I packed my documents, the commission letter, and a set of notarized permits showing my new rights. Then I printed copies of the survey maps, the transfer certificates, and the service logs showing every watt they had pulled from my grid. Evidence. Clean and surgical. The meeting took place in the community hall, a modern building built on my former field. The irony didn't escape me. I arrived a few minutes late. The room buzzed with polite applause as Linda stood at the podium. Draped in her usual composure, she was speaking about progress, sustainability, and shared vision, words as hollow as the insulation in her stolen wires. "We've come a long way," she said, "thanks to the unity of our residents and the support of our partners." When she noticed me enter, her smile wavered slightly before returning to its polished default. "And even our more independent neighbors have contributed in their own ways." The audience laughed softly. I took a seat near the back, waiting for her presentation to end, when she invited open discussion. I stood. "Before we celebrate," I began calmly, "there's a matter of ownership that needs clarification." A few heads turned. Linda's smile tightened. "Mr. Pierce, this isn't the time for personal disputes." I opened my folder and placed the letter from the commission on the front table. "It's not a dispute," I said. "It's documentation." The room grew quiet. I projected a copy of the certificate onto the screen behind her using the hall's display monitor. "Effective as of last week, all electrical and water distribution for Willow Creek falls under the authority of the Pierce Subgrid, state licensed and privately held." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Linda tried to interrupt. "That's absurd. Our network is part of I raised another paper, part of my grid. Your lines, your transformers, your entire system draws power from my private infrastructure. For the past year, every building here has been operating on my supply." I held up the survey report. Independent verification confirmed unauthorized usage extending 30 feet into private property. Each of you has been billed under my account. Silence fell like a curtain. Even the air felt still. Linda's voice cracked slightly. "This can't be true." I turned to her. "Then check your own meters. They all trace back to the substation behind my barn." The board members whispered among themselves. One of them asked, "So what does this mean for us?" I replied evenly. "It means I now own the legal right to provide and regulate the power you use. You will continue receiving service uninterrupted, but under new terms." Linda slammed a folder shut. "You can't just walk in here and declare ownership." I met her eyes. "I didn't declare it. The state did." I placed the notarized deed on the podium. "You've been using my resources without consent. That ends today." A few people in the audience clapped quietly. Hesitant but sincere. Truth has a strange way of sounding both impossible and inevitable when spoken aloud. Linda's composure began to crack. "You're trying to humiliate me," she hissed. "No," I said softly. "I'm correcting the record." I pointed to the display again, where a map showed the overlapping boundaries. "You built your success on borrowed current. All I did was take back the switch." The lights in the room flickered, almost on cue, as a mild storm rolled outside. The timing was poetic. I waited a moment before adding, "I have no intention of cutting service or seeking damages. All I require is acknowledgement of ownership and immediate removal of all unauthorized claims filed under the HOA's name." My tone was calm, but it carried the precision of finality. For a long moment, no one moved. Then an older resident stood up. "If he's telling the truth," she said, "then we owe him gratitude, not argument. He kept this place running while we were misled." More murmurs followed. The balance in the room shifted subtly. Linda's power had always depended on perception, and perception had just turned against her. She gathered her papers with trembling hands, her smile finally gone. "We'll need to consult legal counsel," she muttered. "Do that," I said, "but make sure your lawyer knows how to read a seal." The sentence hung in the air like a closing gavel. After the meeting ended, a few residents approached me quietly. Some apologized. Others simply nodded in silent respect. I didn't need their approval, but it felt like air returning to lungs long deprived. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving puddles that mirrored the glowing streetlights. For the first time in 2 years, I felt peace where there had only been noise. Ownership wasn't about domination. It was about restoration. The current hummed evenly again, like a heartbeat returning to rhythm. When I reached home, I opened the substation panel one last time. The gauges glowed steady, no longer showing strain from the unauthorized load. I flipped a smaller switch to reroute the system through its new configuration. A clean, controlled current flowed back through the grid. Every amp accounted for. The hum was softer now, purer somehow. It wasn't just electricity running through those wires, it was vindication. I stepped back, listening to the steady pulse of power beneath my land. The system was mine again, both in law and in spirit. Linda's empire of influence had gone dim, and the light that remained belonged to those who respected its source. The storm had passed, leaving only clarity in its wake. I turned off the porch light, not out of defiance, but as a quiet gesture of completion. The night after the meeting, silence settled over Willow Creek like a held breath. The once bustling complex dimmed early, its bright windows reduced to a handful of pale squares against the dark. I sat on my porch, listening to the wind sweep across the fields where the subgrid cables ran underground. It was a clean sound, uncluttered by construction or arrogance. Justice has its own frequency, and once it resonates, nothing else can drown it out. I thought about Linda, how control must have felt slipping from her hands slowly at first. Then, all at once, the next morning, a sheriff's car pulled into my driveway. The officer stepped out with a clipboard. "Mr. Pierce, just need your signature," he said. The document confirmed the handover of pending investigations to the district prosecutor. The HOA board had filed a complaint against me for sabotage, but the audit records told a different story. Unauthorized grid alteration, falsified permits, and misuse of public funds all under Linda's watch. I signed the paper without a word. The officer tipped his hat. "Between us," he said, "looks like they built their empire on borrowed wires." His phrasing made me smile. Borrowed wires. That was exactly it. By noon, the news had spread. Local reporters gathered near the community center, filming segments about the mismanagement of resources. I watched from a distance as cameras turned toward Linda's empty office. She hadn't shown up that morning. The board members spoke in careful sentences about internal irregularities and legal compliance. No one used the word theft. Not yet. But they would. Accountability always starts as rumor before it becomes fact. I stayed quiet, letting the current of truth run its natural course. That afternoon, I returned to the ridge to check the lines. The sky was clear, the kind of sharp blue that makes everything look newly washed. Near the edge of the property, I found a broken phone lying in the mud. It was Linda's, the same case, the same initials etched in gold. She must have dropped it during her last inspection. I picked it up, wiped it clean, and saw the screen flicker once before dying. It seemed fitting. Even her devices were losing signal. I placed it on the fence post and walked away, leaving it there like a relic of a failed campaign. As dusk settled, the sheriff called again. "You might want to know," he said. "The state filed formal charges this evening. Unauthorized utility manipulation, forgery, and fraud. 3 counts total." I thanked him, though the words felt unnecessary. This wasn't joy. It was closure. The kind that doesn't shout it, exhales. Linda's name would fade from the community signs soon enough, replaced by paperwork that would quietly set things right. Justice isn't dramatic. It's administrative. That night, the complex lights flickered one final time before stabilizing under my regulated supply. No overloads, no interference. The grid hummed steady, clean, disciplined. I poured myself a drink and stood at the window, watching the power lines stretch across the land like threads of memory. My father used to say that electricity is honest. It flows only where it's allowed. I understood that now more than ever. The system had corrected itself, just as he designed it to, before heading to bed. I walked out to the substation. The air smelled faintly of rain and metal. I opened the panel and checked the readings one last time. Everything was perfect, balanced, alive. The world outside had finally caught up to the truth beneath it, for the first time in years. I didn't feel like I was fighting. I felt like I was maintaining. The distinction mattered. I looked toward the dark horizon where the complex stood. Somewhere in those buildings, people were still working, still living, unaware that the current lighting their rooms now came from the man they once called difficult. That was enough for me. Recognition didn't need applause, it needed continuity. I closed the substation door gently, locking it with the same key my father once carried. The night air hummed softly as the power flowed evenly through the grid. It was no longer revenge, no longer resistance. It was restoration. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way that felt earned. The noise of construction was gone, replaced by the soft hum of wind threading through open fields. The buildings still stood, but their energy had changed. They no longer pulsed with arrogance. They glowed with humility. Ownership had returned to where it belonged, and for the first time since this all began, the power flowing through the wires felt honest again. The commission finalized its ruling. The district court upheld it. And the headlines that once called me difficult now used another word, vindicated. Justice doesn't erase scars, but it reminds you that healing is possible. One evening, I walked down to the stream at the edge of my property. The water was clear again after months of runoff from the construction site. I crouched, letting the cool current pass through my fingers. My father used to say that water remembers. It finds its course, even if you block it. Power, I realized, works the same way. You can steal it, divert it, disguise it, but eventually it returns to its rightful flow. I looked up toward the complex and saw families moving in and out of the stores. Life was normal again, maybe even better. People had stopped avoiding me. Some waved when they passed by. That was enough. A week later, I received a letter from the prosecutor's office. Linda had taken a plea deal. No grand trial, no spectacle. Just a quiet confession filed under seal. She was fined and barred from holding any administrative position for 10 years. Martin, my former apprentice, lost his engineering license. I thought I'd feel satisfaction, maybe triumph. But what I felt instead was clarity. Their punishment didn't matter as much as the principle that survived. Systems fail, people fall, but the truth remains wired into the ground. I folded the letter and placed it beside my father's old blueprints. The story had come full circle. That night, I decided to restore something I'd ignored for too long. Behind the barn was a small wooden well my grandfather built in the 1950s. It had long since dried out, but I spent the evening clearing debris, replacing the pulley, and polishing the old metal bucket. It wasn't about water anymore. It was about memory. Every scrape of wood and twist of rope felt like reclaiming something deeper than land or power. It felt like reclaiming dignity. When I was done, I lowered the bucket into the shallow well, hearing the faint echo of its descent. The sound was clean and final, like the end of a long sentence. In the following days, the HOA under new leadership announced an initiative to partner with private landowners for future projects. They even asked me to consult. I declined politely. Keep your lights on, I told them. That's all the consultation I need. I wasn't interested in revenge or recognition. What I wanted was balance, the kind that doesn't need signatures to exist. The new president, a younger woman with steadier eyes, thanked me anyway. You reminded everyone what accountability means, she said. I nodded. I reminded myself, too. On Sunday morning, I hosted a small gathering. Neighbors came, some bringing food, others just curiosity. We grilled by the stream, the one that now ran clear again. It wasn't a celebration of victory, it was a return to normalcy. Children ran between the old power poles, the same ones my father and I had once raised. One of them pointed at the substation and asked, "Does that make the lights work?" I smiled. "Yes," I said, "but only if you respect what powers it." The boy nodded as if he understood. And maybe he did. Sometimes lessons don't need speeches, they just need living examples. When evening came, I walked to the ridge one last time. The sun dipped low, painting the horizon in shades of gold and copper. The 12 buildings glowed softly in the distance, no longer symbols of theft, but of transformation. I could hear the faint hum of current running through the grid, steady and pure. The same system that once carried deceit now carried stability. I realized then that this story wasn't about electricity, or even about property. It was about integrity, the invisible current that keeps everything working when no one's watching. I looked down at the stream, now calm under the setting sun, and saw my reflection ripple across it. The water mirrored what I felt inside, stillness after turbulence. I turned and walked back toward the house, the porch light already glowing, powered by the same current that ran through every home in Willow Creek. The difference now was that everyone knew whose name stood behind it, and that was enough. Before I went inside, I looked once more at the darkening horizon and said quietly to myself, the current returns to its source. It wasn't pride, it was truth. Every wire hums with intent. Every system reflects its maker. You can build over fairness. You can bury honesty under layers of ambition. But in the end, what's grounded in integrity will always outlast what's built on deceit. If this story spoke to you, let it be a reminder justice isn't a weapon. It's a current. It doesn't strike. It flows. And it always finds its way home. If you believe that truth and accountability still matter, stay with the HOA stories, where every tale reminds us that power is only real when it's earned, not taken.